My name is Erin Boggs. I'm the Executive Director of Open Communities Alliance, which is the organization I founded in 2013 to address the fact that Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the nation. And thinking about housing issues is a particularly important lever to working to undo that. I'm originally from Washington, D.C. I grew up in something of a civil rights community there. My parents came out of the civil rights movement. I'm a graduate of the D.C. public schools. My graduating class was about 87% kids of color. So I had what I think of as a really special opportunity to be a white student in a predominantly Black and Latino school system, which shaped my choice of profession. It shaped my group of friends. It shaped my understanding of the world, and is part of why I'm dedicated to these issues now. I came to Connecticut for college at Wesleyan, went back to DC for law school at Georgetown, knowing I wanted to work on civil rights issues and housing issues in particular, and then ended up back in Connecticut working for the ACLU, and very fortunately happened to work for the ACLU in Connecticut with a legal director who was very focused on these issues, Phil Tegler. And went from there into private practice for a while, worked eventually as the deputy director of the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, and then started Open Communities Alliance.
Terrific, thanks. I'll put all three of the questions in. So just you should remember these are all in the email that I sent you to prompt you to see if we would be able to do an interview. But just to go over them real quick now, how and why do you think zoning matters for achieving greater equity in Connecticut and beyond? What kinds of reforms could help make zoning more equitable, especially where you're working, but also at higher levels too? So that's sort of the broad portfolio of the kinds of things that you think could work there. And then third, we'll zero in on how you and Open Communities Alliance are working, within that broad portfolio of options to carry forward the work. We'll talk a little bit as we go, I hope, about like why you chose that pathway and what your theory of change is ultimately, which is about how you go from knowing there's a problem to having solved it. So that's where we are, but let me go back to the first question now and just have you address how and why you think zoning matters for achieving greater equity in Connecticut and beyond.
Well, I think at the center of the issue of zoning is the ability to have choice in housing, particularly for lower income families who are disproportionately Black and Latino. And we know of the reams of research now that indicate that where you live has an impact on opportunity, access, and success later in life. I think where our field needs to fill out the information a little bit is helping people understand the impact that exclusionary zoning and limits on where affordable housing is located actually has on communities that are high poverty areas, and understanding that there's a real negative impact there that is played out in terms of lower income communities becoming beholden to slumlords, in terms of concentrating poverty and making schooling more challenging, in terms of undergirding housing instability. So there's a whole field there, but taken together, this notion of the availability of housing and where it's located is one reason I think it's really important. Connected to that is obviously school access, and that in Connecticut, because we have a very town-based system for supporting schools, is a huge, huge problem. Our school system is exceptionally segregated. Another piece of this, and part of the reason I work on this issue, and it's something that, again, I think in our field is I think those of us who have been in this work for a long time sort of think of it as, well, of course, this is why we're doing it, but no one really talks about it very much, and we should. Which is, if we're really focused on getting rid of prejudice and racism, we actually have to have real, solid, and equal friendships with people who are not the same race as we are. And I think all of the conversation that I have seen happen leading up to and including the murder of George Floyd has been struggling a little bit with how to address racism and prejudice, and hasn't really talked about this particular piece of it. And so I think it's really fundamental. I think it's set against a backdrop where you have a whole range of opinions among families we work with and colleagues and friends who are Black and Latino about where they want to live. There are opinions that are completely understandable about not wanting to move to white communities, and no one should have to do that. On the flip side, there are lots of families who do. And so allowing those choices to happen when a family is interested in a choice like that, I think is a critical step to fundamentally addressing racism and prejudice in our country. And then the third reason, and I think this is also related, is I think it's important to have, to look at exclusionary zoning and address where affordable housing can go as a way of having a functioning democracy. I mean, what we have right now in Connecticut, at least, is a world of have and have-nots. And the legislature is dominated by predominantly white legislators from predominantly white and wealthier communities that ultimately have the votes to make a decision about any topic. And so when you have topics that are felt more acutely in certain areas, whether it is about educational disparities or anything related to poverty or the criminal justice system, it's very hard to get actually, the soundest public policy decisions made by our legislative leaders. So those are the three reasons that I think it's most important to be looking at exclusionary zoning.
Thanks. That was really valuable and super clear. And maybe if you have other ideas about what equity looks like as we go along, we can circle back around to that question too, because obviously you have an idea of what equity means. And so maybe as you're talking about the next couple questions, you can, really sort of center on, if it's for equity, then what do I mean by equity, and what and how does that manifest in the organization where I work? So the second one, as I said, is more of the broad portfolio question, the kinds of reforms that could make zoning more equitable, especially in Connecticut, but also at higher levels.
Sure. I've been in the state of Connecticut now for 20 years, and a lot of that time has been spent thinking about housing generally, but also zoning in particular. And how we can make changes to zoning that will really advance the notions of desegregated housing choices. And we've had iterations. So we've had an effort in Connecticut, and we have a law in Connecticut that is our Affordable Housing Appeals Act. It basically says that any town that has less than 10% affordable units as defined by the Act is open to a lawsuit if a developer comes along, proposes a development with at least 30% affordable units and is rejected by the town's Planning and Zoning Commission. The developer can take the town to court, and basically the burden, they get a leg up in court. The burden shifts, and the town has to basically prove it did something right, rather than the developer having to prove the town did something wrong. And that's been an important law, but it has not yielded anywhere near the number of affordable units that we actually need to address the lack of units in the state. And so what the law has led to is, rather than a conscious effort on the part of exclusionary towns to think and plan and get to that 10% number. It's been more a process of, for most towns that are whiter and wealthier, kind of hiding their head in the sand and just hoping a developer never comes along, and when they do, fight them tooth and nail. And so, I think that was an important effort, and it has created some housing, but we are ready to do more in Connecticut. And as we've looked around at what has worked elsewhere and been tried elsewhere, we've looked at things like inclusionary zoning and really focusing first on Montgomery County, but thinking about how it's been used elsewhere in the country. We've been looking at these missing middle proposals. We've been looking at efforts like the housing element effort in California and the fair share effort coming out of the Mount Laurel cases in New Jersey, and really settled on this notion of fair share as something that achieves the goals of meeting the need for affordable housing, but also doing it in a way that generates desegregated housing choices. And for those who haven't followed that, the premise is basically to figure out how much affordable housing is needed. And there's a whole, question around how you do that, but it is done. Let's assume it's done and done well. And then allocate that out to towns in a logical way that considers both their resources and maybe also what they've done on the topic in the past. And then set up a implementation and enforcement regime such that the town has a real incentive to plan by itself to figure out how to get this housing done. And what that does is it both honors something that is very important to people in a lot of Connecticut towns, this notion of local control, being able to sort of have a say over the destiny of their town. But it also sets a solid and meaningful goal so that each town is playing a role in solving the affordable housing challenges of the state. So as we've thought about reforms that would really work and be equitable in the state, that's where we've landed.
So to be real explicit here about what equitable means in this case, I can infer it because I've been in the field for a while, but the students who are taking this are going to be brand new. It's going to be the first week of this class for them. And so maybe you could spell out just a little bit more how a set of formulas could potentially lead to an equitable result like that.
Sure. And I think it's, I think foundational to this, and I'm sure this will be part of the readings that your students are looking at, is an understanding of the history of segregation in our nation, and how we have ended up in a place, and in Connecticut, for example, Blacks and Latinos on average earn about half or less of what the average white family earns. And so, if we're going to be talking about solving this housing problem in a way that is equitable, and also considering all these other things like access to opportunity and trying to address racism, we need to be thinking about the affordable piece of housing. And my cat is going to be joining the class. So when we are looking at those formulas, what we have done is, and really building off of what New Jersey, the New Jersey model, we've looked at sort of the holes, the gaps in the housing world in Connecticut. So we know that there aren't enough 2 and 3 bedroom and higher units. We know that there's a real inclination on the part of suburban towns to be thinking about senior only housing, and if they're getting something done, it's through senior apartments. And so we have geared the fair share goals to fill those missing voids. And we also know that it's very hard to get housing at the 30% of area median income level and below. And in Connecticut, what that works out to, very roughly, is about $30,000 a year for a family of 4. It's very hard for families in that income bracket to afford any housing without the assistance of a subsidy. And even at higher levels, it's obviously a real struggle. So if we can incentivize towns to be pushing for housing that meets that need, meets those, sort of fills those gaps in the state, it's going to result in a much more equitable housing landscape. So I hope that, let me know if there's more to fill in there that would be helpful, but that's one shot at it.
That's good. And maybe as we go, you can also fill in some more sort of ground level, or at least, this town versus that town level contrasts, so that a national audience can really get a sense about what the difference is between a Darien and a Bridgeport, for example. And so maybe you could be thinking about that a little bit as you answer. But you really zeroed in fast on your proposal for fair share. I know that Open Communities has been working on other elements of housing equity. And so do you want to sort of list some of the other things and tell us how they relate to that more, let's say, legislative rule change kind of thing? And is it really only legislation? Is there more to it than legislation when you're talking about fair share?
Sure. And you tell me, some of this goes beyond zoning, so let me know if you want me to
That's fine.
keep it on. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think we're using the term largely because it's legible enough to our students to be able to scan, but really it's about equitable land use, and that as an underpinning of a more inclusive and just communities where people have equal opportunities to succeed.
So yeah, some of the other things that we're looking at are things like subsidies that the government provides. And this is another part of why all of these things, including zoning, are so important to focus on, because these are rules set by the government. And when those rules are generating the segregated landscape, if we're thinking in terms of equity, we need to think very hard about those and what can be done to realign those so they're actually advancing housing opportunity for everybody. But one program, as an example, in terms of housing subsidies, is the low-income housing tax credit. This is a national program run through the Department of Treasury. And I won't explain the details, but basically tax credits come into a state and are used to generate affordable housing units. In Connecticut, 74% of the tax credit units that have been generated in higher poverty areas. They're certainly outside of those high and very high opportunity areas that we often refer to. And so what we have here is a state informed, it's a federal policy that is informed by state priorities that the state sets. So we have a government program that has in fact created thousands and thousands of units of housing in a way that just cements segregated housing patterns. And so it's important to focus on that, I think, for itself, on that program, but it's also important to focus on this program, and our colleagues in New Jersey have really found this, in that when those program priorities are changed, meaning a developer who wants those credits knows they're going to be more likely to win those credits if they're proposing something, or a portion of those credits, if they're proposing something for a area without a lot of affordable housing, it gives them also an incentive to take on the zoning battle, because it ends up being a zoning battle with many of these towns. And if a developer has no chance of getting these credits to create the affordable units there, and they know they're going to have a battle with the town, they're never going to do it. So sometimes when you change one piece of the puzzle, it actually supports changing other pieces of the puzzle. So that's one element. Another element that we're focusing on is and I think there probably are some other states where this is an issue, but it may be a little bit unique to Connecticut and the Northeast. Is there is a state law that says that housing authorities have to operate only in their own jurisdiction, and what that ends up doing is it limits what housing authorities can do on 3 topics. So housing authorities, among other things, are involved in building public housing. They're involved with locating, project-based assistance. So it's money that goes to a private developer who then promises to rent to low-income families. And they're involved in administering what's called tenant-based housing choice vouchers, or Section 8, which is where families take vouchers and use them in the open market, rental market. All 3 of those, if limited to certain areas, if those areas are already high poverty areas and disproportionately Black and Latino, which is where the biggest housing authorities are located, you just reiterate the segregated housing patterns and actually make them worse. So another thing that we've done, and Rolf, to your question about avenues to get there, it is not all legislation. Unfortunately, it ends up being litigation as well. In addition to public education, there's sort of a whole range of tools. But in the instance of housing authority jurisdiction, we actually have a complaint pending at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development against the state of Connecticut, alleging that this housing authority jurisdiction limitation violates the Fair Housing Act and creates a disparate impact on Black and Latino families. And so, these are other tools. And, the reason that a state like Connecticut, any state, might pay attention to this is because the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development sends them a lot of money. And that money is tied to not only following these laws, but in particular following this obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, which is another element of our claim. Another sort of the last thing I'll mention that we're doing, which is maybe its own category, is we've created a subsidiary nonprofit called Open Communities Trust, which we're just getting going, and we're sort of strategizing around how to execute completely. But the notion is that we can have this trust vehicle that is intended to work in partnership with the developer of affordable housing, but the trust takes on the role of getting the housing through zoning. And whether that is through really good communication and education and outreach with the receiving community, or if it's through ultimately litigation, those things are on the table. And the other thing that this partnership with the developer does is it hopefully allows us as an organization to be advancing some of these fill the void strategies, so that we are working with the developer if they agree to have more than just 1-bedroom units in the development, if they're saying these are going to be available to families, if they're saying maybe that it'll be handicap accessible, if they're saying that some of the units will be available at lower income targeting levels. So that's just another strategy, and that allows us not only to push those things, but also to, if we need to, have the Fair Housing Act on the table. Because if you do all of those things and you have an affirmative marketing plan reaching across racial lines when you're marketing, there's going to be the Fair Housing Act will be sitting with you in the room when you're negotiating for that development.
Some of these things sound really innovative to me. I've never heard of the last approach you mentioned, but that's super interesting. Where did that idea come from? Is it your own brainchild, or is it something that you strategized with other people about?
It's a combination. I think we've been trying to think about sort of the missing piece in the housing puzzle, where you don't have someone who's pushing for that affordability and the higher opportunity location. We've been thinking about how you actually get standing under the Fair Housing Act. It's very hard to do that, and this is an avenue to that. But we've also been fortunate to have a really great partnership with the Yale Law School housing clinic and community and economic development clinic. So we've been working in partnership with professors there as well.
That's great. I hope the idea spreads. Well, you've already talked some about how you and Open Communities Alliance are working to make zoning more equitable. But could you maybe point a bit to a little bit, sort of elaborate some on the route of politics, the route of narrative building, the route of litigation? It seems like you have all of those elements working for you, because let me back up a second. A lot of the time people, and in fact, in the last interview that we had, uh, the person we interviewed talked about all the great programs they have the sort of collective will to work on in Salt Lake City. And the politics just seem kind of obvious to her. They're really good at collaborating, but on this issue and in that state, that's not the case. You're working really hard on a lot of different fronts to get the permission, essentially, or to put a mandate in place so that the right things start to happen more predictably instead of like one court battle at a time. So again, you've got narrative working, you've got the politics and, probably coalition building and deal making going there. Like, how are you thinking about those elements working together within a bigger picture of getting to do the things we know would work if only we could?
Sure. Well, we've been at this through Open Communities Alliance since 2013. And our overall theory of change is that we should be working on two fronts. We should be working on an education and outreach front, which can include some of the legislative, efforts, and we should be working on a litigation front. So while we're moving along, trying to change hearts and minds, there's also a legal strategy that will, sort of come in and support changes down the road that we have already built some support for on the outreach side. And so for the last several years, when we started, we were very much focused on the outreach and education and giving the legislative process a good solid try on a number of issues. And so we've put forth bills to change that housing authority jurisdiction issue that have not come to fruition. We've put forth bills on changing the way the low-income housing tax credit is run in the state that caused a big kerfluffle, and there was a lot of pushback to it. And then we've put forth bills on zoning that were very, very modest, that didn't go anywhere either. So we knew this. We sort of anticipated that, and it fit in with what we anticipated needing to do next, which is have litigation combined with these outreach efforts. And it's been very interesting post the uprising around race issues over the summer to actually see some changes in suburban, mostly white suburban towns. We've had an incredible number of calls coming in from people living in those towns who really want to see a difference and want to take action. I think we'll see what happens ultimately, whether people who are very upset about seeing police officers actually kill someone are also willing to take that to the point of having mixed income housing next door. Like, I think that's a jump that not all people are going to be able to make. But that gives me a little more hope in what we might be able to do through education and outreach and maybe the legislative process. But ultimately, I think what needs to happen is we do need to do both these things at the same time, and we need to have some requirements coming through the courts that some of them may end up needing translation through legislation. So I could see that, particularly around zoning, that is how it would need to play out. But I think all of these efforts are important. What we want is by the time something we're doing gets to court and we are proposing a solution and it gets into the, the public sphere, that people say, oh, of course, fair share. That's a great idea.
So as I can compare what we've been talking about with the last couple of interviews and the way a lot of our students, I think, are thinking about zoning for equity, a lot of people are really thinking about the inequities that happen within established cities, either gentrification that's happening in the more affluent or, say, high opportunity or cooler neighborhoods, or a lot of injustice that happens because of toxic conditions next to freeways and incinerators and dumps and so on. You haven't mentioned those very much, the within community kinds of things. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about whether that's a strategic choice, whether your organization doesn't view that as a problem, and how I think putting a point on the tax credit question and the pushback that you got, I would assume, but maybe you can confirm, that some of the pushback was from people and community organizations in those low-income communities themselves who are living with terrible old housing, who say our housing is terrible. We don't want to have to move out to a white community to get opportunity. So why are you changing the rules so that we can't have better housing that is in fact more affordable than the slumlord housing that we're living in right now? So I think that's, you must hear that. And I'm kind of wondering where you are and where your organization is on the solving inequities that are zoning and housing related inside the predominantly Black and Latino cities within Connecticut.
I was on a call the other day with a bank that was, was being questioned under its Community Revitalization Act performance. And so through that had been compelled to get together with a lot of community partners to sort of do better. And so they brought in a lot of the community partners they had all worked with for years, and then the organization that had inspired this brought us in as well. And of the 20 or so community partners that were on that call talking to the bank, many of whom the bank had been funding for years, we were the only group that took the position or worked on this notion that families should have, low-income families should have regional choices in where they live. So what all those other groups are doing, some of which is, emergency help for very low-income families, most of which is that, some of which is revitalization. Those efforts are critically important. Those are so urgently needed. And there's lots of groups doing that. And they're partners with us. We work with them all the time. But very few groups, and I think this is probably true nationally as well, are ensuring that are working to ensure that families who want a broader choice have it. And I think part of the reason for that is politically it's very hard. You do get this pushback, and we've gotten it, I'd say, more this year than in the prior years. I've been working with, as part of OCA, from some political leaders in cities sort of saying, why are you working on zoning? What about people living, what do I get out of it? What do my constituents get out of it? And I think that's part of the reason that I made the comment towards the beginning of our conversation about how I think as a movement, we need to be articulating better how these things connect. Because gentrification, part of the reason we have gentrification, this is not the only reason and it's not the only solution, but part of the reason is because where, at least in Connecticut, where affordable housing has been corralled into such a limited number of areas that if anything comes along to destroy that housing or fix it up, immediately a whole bunch of people are displaced and there's nowhere else to go because there's no other affordable housing. The only place to go is a very high, often a very high poverty area. There are several areas around the state in cities where 60% of the housing units, and I'm thinking in Hartford, I'm thinking in Bridgeport in particular, 60% of the housing in a neighborhood is subsidized by the government. And that doesn't count families who have those mobile Section 8 vouchers. And that is not sustainable. That is not sustainable from the perspective of providing services to a community, from funding schools, doing any of the regular service provision jobs that a city has to do. And that's not fair to the families who lived there, over the last 60 years, maybe before a lot of that subsidized housing went in. It's not fair to the families who want to live in subsidized housing. And it's because the government has done it that way. So that's sort of part of our perspective. Another part is we work with a lot of low-income families. We're working right now with 250 families who live in, we're living in one of those neighborhoods in the north end of Hartford where 60% of the housing is subsidized, where there are assassination-style shootings outside of apartment buildings with kids watching. I mean, this is real. This isn't just sort of a made-up stereotype. These are families we're talking to, and this is what they're experiencing. They were forced to relocate from HUD-subsidized housing that was in atrocious condition, was not overseen by either the landlord or HUD, with mice running across babies' beds, with molds, with dangerous anyway, the whole gamut of things. We talked to our clients about where they wanted to live. We did a survey of as many people as we could get a hold of. It wasn't everybody, but 60% of the families wanted to leave the neighborhood and wanted to leave Hartford. So, I think it's important for the families who want to stay to have the resources to rebuild their community in their own vision. But I also think we cannot stand for government policies that prevent families who want other choices from having them.
Thanks. That's a really useful answer, and much better and better grounded than I could have given myself, even though I felt the same way myself for quite a long time. So let's put ourselves in some future in which by a combination of legal action, political organizing, federal support, Connecticut does have a fair share system in place. How will you know? That's a goal, but it's also a means to an end, right? So how do you know that? How are you going to? Are you thinking about how to build in a system so that once you have it, you know that it's going to work, or is that a bridge you'll cross on the happy day you get there?
I think more needs to be done on that. It's a great question. We do have in the legislation that was proposed on Fair Share this year. So we actually had a bill. It made it out of one committee and got held up in another when, this shouldn't, I really think this shouldn't be by a partisan issue, but in this case, it was Republicans threatened to basically filibuster it in committee. But within that bill, we have a couple of requirements about reporting so that we know what's going on. We have obligations to market affirmatively across racial lines. So I think measuring that, those pieces are really important. And, so I think we need to do that. And what I've seen in terms of the way they're looking at it and measuring it in New Jersey is working. And so I think maybe modeling, sort of digging into those and modeling what we're doing here on that would be helpful.
Thanks. That's a good answer. One of the differences between urban planning and public policy is that planners like to dream a lot of the time, but they don't think all that much about the implementation, evaluation, monitoring, and then the reinvention. like every comprehensive plan starts as if it were the very first one for a community, pretty much all the time, instead of with an apology for all the things that either were done wrong or were done right and had terrible impacts or were never even started. Sorry, I'm soapboxing, and I'm going to have to edit that part out of the interview since it is one. I want to give you a chance to sort of address anything else that you'd like to, that that maybe we haven't gotten to or haven't asked you directly, that may be in your mind that you want the students to know as they embark on a bunch of different projects across the United States. Ultimately, they'll be doing projects that are of direct relevance to the local communities or states in which they're working, and then we'll bring all that work together. We'll certainly invite you to see what that is. No obligation there. But maybe if you can think a bit about what these planning students, undergrads, grads, they'll be graduating, all of them pretty soon, what you'd like them to take with them into the workplace and into their lives that you think will make them more effective at zoning for equity.
Sure. I mean, I think it's fantastic that the students will be working all across the country in different geographies, and I think it's probably clear in the interviews that they'll see that the geography matters a lot. I think being attuned to what's going on in any local place. We work quite often with folks at Public Advocates in California, and their mindset about gentrification and about these issues is very different from what we're seeing here in most, not all, but most places in Connecticut. And so, I think that's an important lesson for us to understand how to think about all these policies in a way that understands that local context. That's one thing I would say. The other thing I should have mentioned earlier is that we do have a coalition, which is, I think evolving and developing. And I'm a civil rights leader, civil rights lawyer, not a community organizer. So I feel like I'm always learning about that. But I think that type of organizing is important and it is critical to this, and is different from the kind of community organizing that at least I think of as, the regular way community organizing is done, which is very specific to a place. And in the housing world, it's often about organizing around housing conditions or the proposals to knock down public housing. And so, I call it affinity organizing, so that what we're doing is finding people in cities and suburbs and rural areas who all care about this issue, and trying to bring them together to work on advancing solutions.
Thanks so much. That's really great. I want to give you a chance to say to ask any more questions, and then we'll wrap up within about 10 minutes or so.
Well, thank you, Rolf, and thank you, Erin. So my question is, well, first of all, you talked about low-income housing, right? And there's an issue in intersectionality, thinking about people that might be from a different ethnicity, also a different race. And it seems like also your goal is like to open up the suburbs. So and also a small town. So my question is not about zoning in particular, but it is about other issues of equity that might not be related to being low income, like being a single mom, being like a part of the LGBT community, having a disability, and like how then you make sure that that housing is open for those groups that might not be low income, but it's important to for further equity.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We actually just put out this report that also coincidentally is called Zoning for Equity. And one part of the introduction spends some time talking about how addressing, we're civil rights lawyers. We're a civil rights organization. We're coming, and we're focused very much on low-income Black and Latino families, but doing the right thing on zoning and these other issues for, you know, for that group is also going to have really positive effects on housing opportunities for all the other groups you just mentioned, maybe with the exception of the LGBTQ, in the sense that our research in Connecticut is that the income disparities aren't there in the same way as they are for families who have a member who has a disability and single moms. So I think on housing, it definitely helps. I also think that you're going to see, again, I think policy change that will be more responsive when you have communities that have greater diversity, and legislators hearing more from just seniors who want more affordable housing, but from people who all need affordable housing, maybe for different reasons. There's some nice examples in New Jersey where, you know, fair share has, in towns where fair share has made particular progress, where you also see changes in the school system. So more work on hiring diverse teacher pools. There's Cherry Hill, just a town in New Jersey, just mandated to graduate from high school a class on, you know, the history of race in America. So I think you're going to see that these changes will have positive impacts that reach lots of other people. So, you know, regardless of income as well, but also other people groups that are disproportionately lower income.
Thanks. That's a great answer. And I think it may be a really good place for us to leave the question of a theory of change, because what you imply here is that the immediate goal of opportunity for those who've been excluded systematically in the past based on race will have spillover benefits or magnifying benefits down the road for other people who've also been affected by systemic racism in the way we make our laws and build our cities.